we all know, apologies, I think I've just been interrupted. Let me try that again. So as we all know, as a result of the pandemic, the world is now further off track to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Extreme poverty has risen dramatically and inequalities widened, with a disproportionate impact on some of the world's most poorest and vulnerable people. Now, the swift vaccination programs, alongside bold economic support and stimulus packages, have paved the way for recovering in advanced economies in particular. But global recovery has been unequal, with an imminent recovery remaining pretty much out of reach for many developing countries. And it's against this background of significantly increased need and demand, constrained by domestic resources and an ever-increasing financing gap for the SDGs, that the international community now need to think rapidly about how to increase the mobilization of traditional forms of resources, while also designing new innovative financing solutions and policies and approaches in order to tackle the consequences of the pandemic in order to achieve the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, we were already had a big challenge in front of us in regards to achieving the 2030 agenda, but this has now increased significantly as a consequence of global events over the last 2 or so years. Now, today's spotlight session will therefore explore the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has affected global and national economies, their capacities to both confront the crisis and to get back on track to achieve the SDGs. We will look at the state of the global economy, we'll explore regional perspectives and variances, and we'll seek to identify some policy recommendations to close the financing gap. We have an esteemed panel of 6 speakers for you today, and we have 15 minutes, so a mini challenge in and of itself. So first, what we'll do is we'll hear from our 3 experts who will set out the global, regional, and thematic perspectives. And then we will move to our 3 discussants who will respond to the presentations made. But after the first speakers, I will spend a little bit of time synthesizing some questions from our audience for the panelists. So please do feel free to put your questions into the chat box, and I will see if we've got time to go through them. So let me turn to our first speaker to kick us off. I've got Mr. Naveed Hanif, the Director of Financing for Sustainable Development Office of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, who is also the UN Sous Sherpa to the G20 Finance and Main Tracks. Mr. Hanif, over to you to get us kicked off. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpinder, and I want to thank the UN Foundation for the opportunity. You have framed the conversation very nicely and succinctly. I will make 5 brief points to address some of the issues that you have raised. You said the global economic recovery is uneven, and the sad part is stagnating, with increasing risks of permanent scarring. So what are we witnessing? That after the fastest expansion in over 4 decades in 2021, the recovery is losing steam and faces major uncertainties and risks. It is projected that it will slow to 4%, followed by growth of 3.5% in 2023. The outlook is at risk due to other challenges also, like new waves of COVID-19 infections, unequal access to vaccines, fiscal space constraints, persistent labor market challenges, lingering supply chain bottlenecks, and of course, rising inflationary pressures. So the SDG financing gap is estimated to have increased at least by 50%, if not more, from $22.5 trillion annually to $3.7 trillion or more by some estimates. So the picture is not very promising. My second message, emerging markets and developing economies are expected to spend 10.7% of GDP this year in servicing external debt. Debt sustainability is growing increasingly precarious in many low and middle income countries. Let me give you some facts. 60% of low income countries are already in or at high risk of debt distress. In 2022, which is this year, 74 low-income nations will have to repay an estimated $35 billion in official bilateral and private sector loans, which is up 45% from 2020. Debt stocks remain elevated after reaching 263% of GDP in 2020. Just look at what it is taking away. External public debt service was greater than healthcare expenditure in at least 62 developing countries. And the public external debt service is also greater than education expenditure, at least in 36 countries. So diversion of important resources away from the SDGs. Addressing the debt overhang will require comprehensive solutions that address both interest payments and debt stock. And we have made a number of proposals, including fixing the sovereign debt architecture at the global level. It also requires ensuring all countries have access to sufficient liquidity by continuing to channel the SDRs. ODA has increased, but it's largely in the form of loans. Additional grant finance will be key in enabling low middle-income countries to invest in the SDGs. My third message, domestic resource mobilization through, of course, tax policy and improvements in tax administrations. Unfortunately, the tax stake in developing countries continues to lag behind developed countries. Actually, it is diverging. In emerging markets and developing economies, general government revenue as a percent of GDP fell by nearly 2 percentage points in 2020 to 24.3%, whereas in developed countries, it rose to 35.9%. So what do we need? We need to build modernized tax systems with progressive tax policies, better tax collection, help developing countries to increase the tax to GDP ratio. But we also need global international tax cooperation to address the issues of greater coordination, but also illicit financial flows, which are a major drain on the resources of developing countries. Domestic resource mobilization requires collective global action to stop the drain of resources from developing countries. My fourth message, key, is private SDG financing. It requires incentives, regulations, but also better project planning by developing countries. So what is the scenario right now? Many pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds have trillions of dollars available. If a fraction of these resources is aligned to the SDGs, we will fill the financing gap for the SDGs. I would rather call it the financing opportunity. It's not a gap. It will unleash employment and, of course, help the planet to grow healthier. But that also requires, and there's good news, the bond issuance to different sustainable investment criteria, it has increased many-fold since 2013. It was $111.6 million, now it's $852 billion. But we do not have common standards, governance and guidelines to clearly measure the impact and ensure that it's not SDG washing. So that avenue also needs to be addressed. Mobilizing private investment also depends on the country's ability to present viable project pipelines. My last message, what are we doing as the United Nations? We are conducting policy analysis on key issues. We have made proposals. How do you increase fiscal space? Give them long-term loans with very concessional conditions. Also, non-commercial loans, grants to countries to create fiscal space for them to invest in the SDGs. Inject long-term horizon in decision-making. The Financing for Development Forum, which will be held in April this year, will bring together all actor and policymakers, private sector, civil society, to advance these solutions to global agreements. Of course, we are also producing the Financing for Sustainable Development report, with 62 organizations and institutions, which will present ideas on creating fiscal space. And then the SDG Investment Fair, which brings together CEOs from all over the world to advance investments that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we invite everyone to engage in these platforms. And last message is, for this particular forum, partnerships remain critical for innovative financing, for leveraging the strength of both public and private sectors. That means de-risking investments which can go to countries which badly need them, but because of risk perception are not getting it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Naveed Hanif. That was absolutely fantastic. A very succinct but incredibly detailed presentation, which actually painted a rather bleak picture at the beginning with rising debt burdens and lack of resources, access to resources. But I really liked the sort of 5 different messages you presented of where action can happen. And I'm hoping we'll be able to go back to those in the discussion, and maybe our discussants will pick those up too and explore them a little bit further. Now, let me just turn to our next panelist, who will provide a more of a regional perspective from the continent of Africa. Mr. Adedeji Adrian, who is the Director of Research at the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, who is based in Nigeria. I'd like to invite you to now give us a more of a continental perspective from Africa and how we need to bring back the focus on the SDGs following the impacts of the pandemic on the continent.
Okay, so thanks, Apinda. And I mean, we've set the discussion in a very good kind of background around when we look at COVID-19 effect, it's both a health and economic effect. But for a continent like Africa, we've had more of the economic impact. Of course, we've undergone the various waves of the disease, but in terms of health burden and death rates, compared to the economic effect and economic cost that we are seeing, that has actually been much. And if we look at and really contextualize that around SDG, it's about how do we recover the economic kind of framework that can support the continent. Prior to the COVID-19, there has been a lot of setback around achievement of SDGs. Majority of the countries of the continent are already having kind of a lot of challenges. But I think COVID-19 amplified that in many ways. But I just want to emphasize the issue of fiscal space and that how that has changed with COVID-19. So when we talk about fiscal space, I think we need to look at the quality and quantity of in terms of finance. And COVID-19 has affected both in many ways. So if you look at the quantity of what we can spend, domestic resources mobilization is rather minimal. Of course, ODA, we see that during 2020 and 2021 really increased, but that is mostly to low-income countries. And when we talk about private sector finance, it's also kind of constrained. The uncertainty around financing model, I think, is a major issue that we have seen manifested. So before, the unpredictability of ODA has actually been the issue we emphasize on. And the solution that we have talked about in the past has been private sector mobilization and government's kind of tax system. But again, uncertainty actually has been amplified around this kind of different financing model. So in a way, it's pointing to the fact that we can't rely on one just financial model in terms of recovery. We need to actually look at these various models. Even there is uncertainty, but there are also area of strength for each of the countries around the continent. So we see for some commodity rich countries, they could benefit in some ways when we have this like the recent rise in oil prices. It could support their recovery. But also from others, I mean, it could commodity price crash could have negative effect. So it's about how do we manage these various financing channels. That's number one important thing that we need to do. But we also need to look at the quality in terms of financing, in terms of are we able to really, even with the minimal resources we have, are we able to deliver well? Are we able to, the accountability framework around financing? And again, COVID-19 is amplifying that. We are seeing issue around the institutional weakness around the continent. We are seeing the issue of the triggers and drivers of conflict and governance challenges are actually rising. And that's, you can frame that implication of that for social contract. Would government be able to deliver? I mean, if government could not support efficiently public needs and meet them at the right time, we are seeing a lot of this causing problem. For example, I mean, during COVID-19, when you look at data on conflict, it actually didn't actually decline despite the lockdown. It rises, and those are the kind of challenges that even even when we are not even grappling with the health effects, the economic effects problem, we cannot actually focus on it, because those kind of triggers for governance means resource allocation and accountability framework are very weak. So, I mean, that in a sense gives us a kind of bleak picture in terms of how and where we are heading for COVID-19. But I also want to emphasize areas of opportunities. So, for example, there has been kind of competition for resources. But before now, we know there is economic goals around SDG, there are social goals and there are environmental goals. And so there is this kind of tendency to focus more on the economic goals during COVID-19. But in a way, we need to also balance that. And I think there are kind of way that external support can also be beneficial in these instances. For example, we can see issue of capacity development. One area is, UNDP, they've launched Sdg Investor Maps, which is a kind of strategic way of drawing investors and targeting specific sector of SDG, not just economic sector, but social and environmental sector. And those kind of initiatives is not about even money alone, but in terms of capacity development and information sharing, such that we can all open up resources where and target it where we needed them most. But I think strategic support might be needed at this point in time too. The issue of debt relief and potentials around debt swap for climate change, I think is something that should be in the conversation. That in a way can help us balance some of the challenges in terms of country concentrating on one kind of goals, the economic goals, because that kind of take priority now. But with those kind of external support, capacity development, we can also see a way that we can align achievement of other SDGs goals in the social and environmental sector. The last point I just want to make from my own end is that there are opportunities that we also need to tap into. For example, the revolution in terms of vaccine production. Prior to COVID-19, to make a vaccine, I think it takes decades in order to achieve it. With COVID-19, we can see that there's improvement in technology to actually deliver on that. Just imagine for a continent for Africa, if we can apply this into malaria fight, into HIV fight. These are things that can really, really propel achievement of COVID-19. So those are the opportunities that I also think we need to look at. During COVID-19, digitalization is actually kind of a strategic window for both delivering social palliative to the citizen, but also in terms of how social transaction takes place. And that can be tapped into for structural reforms. And I think it's one area we need to look into. There are also a number of local kind of initiatives that I imagine on the continent that COVID-19 has forced a lot of actors to rethink the process. But on the final note, we cannot actually reset SDG without we actually having a kind of firm foundation. And as much as we talked about economic stability, which is about restoring fiscal space and expanding fiscal capacity of government, structural reforms are also critical, because in the past, African continent has been growing, but the growth has been not been a smooth one, and in some instances, we have not been able to actually grow at the kind of high level that we really, really wish the continent should go because of these structural barriers. We need to actually address this kind of structural barriers as part of the recovery process. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Oecd. I mean, you started off with a sobering presentation highlighting the economic and social challenges faced by the countries of the African continent. But I really like the way you brought in some of the new initiatives, some of those new ideas that are actually offering hope. But you ended there with actually the importance of structural reforms as well to continue to make progress. So you've taken us on a very big journey on a number of issues. And I do hope we'll be able to come back to some of those, but because time is short for the moment, I'm going to move us on to our final stage setting presentation. And I would now like to turn to Dr. Romina Barini, who is the director of the newly established OECD WISE Centre, WISE standing for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity. She's going to present to us some of the upcoming research that the centre has produced on OECD countries, the impact of COVID-19 on their progress towards the SDG. Dr. Romina, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much to the UN Foundation for bringing us together. We can go directly to the next slide, please. And indeed, what I'm going to do is that I will give you a preview of a report that we're going to publish in April. And April is a very important time for the OECD because this is when we organize our main dialogue on SDGs. So it's our SDGs Council. And from now, I just want to invite you all to join that very important event, because this is really the time of the year when we all come together, the OECD members with the new members, and we try to take stock of the progress that was made. The report I'm going to, well, obviously not present in any length or depth, but just give you a basic information on, is actually part of the OECD's action plan on SDGs. This is really an action plan that the organization implemented in 2016 to help member countries to reach SDGs. And this particular report is in fact putting together the existing comparative indicators that countries can use to set their strategic priorities within the SDGs agenda. And so in the report, we do assess the progresses countries are making on each of the targets. And we're trying, of course, to put this in comparison with, well, into the broader context of what's happening in the OECD area as a whole, but also try to understand what are the policy efforts that have been undertaken by countries to do better. One of the aspects that this report always highlights is the outstanding key data gaps where statistical developments are still needed, either to track progress or to actually advance understanding of policy drivers and interconnections of SDGs targets. So this here edition is going really to take a look at the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, in particular, I mean, I obviously not going to tell you anything surprising saying that obviously the pandemic was a very big shock and hampered the progress, and in many cases, for many targets actually, reversed the progress that countries had made on SDGs. So next slide, please. So I should say that, in fact, even before COVID-19 hit, some SDGs targets were close to being met, but performance was already very uneven across the 17 goals of the 2030 agenda. And it wasn't only uneven across the goals and across the targets, but actually it was also uneven across the OECD countries themselves. Here you can see a figure that provides a snapshot of the OECD progress towards the targets. This is based on available data for each of the 17 goals. And in fact, the data show here the distance to the target. So what you can see is that on average, OECD countries have already achieved or are close to achieve at least 25% of the targets for 12 of the 17 goals. So this is what you see in the lighter blue in the chart. However, no target can be classified as close to be reached for the goals that relate to gender equality, climate actions, and reduced inequalities that in this chart are represented in middle or darker blue. So progress on SDGs really requires a granular understanding of country strengths and weaknesses, and you need to go beyond obviously the goals. You need to look at the targets. We know that a few targets have already been met, essentially in OECD areas, those that relate to securing basic needs and living standards to the population. Progress has also been made on actually all the targets that are explicitly expressed and framed in terms of policy tools and frameworks. And I think this is quite interesting. So countries do better when we look at the actual efforts they're making. If we judge those efforts, let's say, by the initiatives, by the tools, by the regulations, by the governance mechanisms, however, they don't do as well if you look at the outcomes, if you actually look at the actual inputs of those initiatives. And I think this is an interesting lesson that we can draw. And in general, really many areas, OECD countries still have a long road to travel. And in particular, really the countries have scope and leeway to ensure that no one is left behind, to restore trust in institutions. This is another quite problematic area for the OECD. And as I already said, to limit pressures on the natural environment. Next slide, please. So here, brief information on some of the Ps. As you know, the whole goals are organized along some of the Ps. Here is about prosperity. And of course, the COVID-19 had an unprecedented impact on the economy for all countries of the world. In the OECD, we say that, in fact, this certainly was the most severe crisis, but also in a way, the shortest recession since World War II. Luckily, most OECD countries implemented measures that restricted economic and social activities to limit contacts, people, and spread of the contagion. I'm saying luckily because we know that in some cases those obviously measures were very successful to protect lives, in some cases also livelihoods, but that of course had a very bad impact on the economy. The impact on output growth has been large in all countries, and in fact it came down to a fall of GDP in the OECD by almost 5% in 2020. The initial impact on OECD labor markets has been 10 times larger than that observed in the first months of the 2008 global financial crisis. And again, that obviously comes as a strong, I think, it really sends sort of a strong signal that this crisis was unprecedented. The rebound has also been steeper. This has been supported by unprecedented support by governments and central banks, and definitely progress in vaccinations in OECD countries. The very good fact that we saw is that a number of social protection schemes have been rolled out, social safety nets, job retention schemes, food assistance programs really have been there to buffer the short-term effects of the crisis on poverty and hunger. However, of course, what is important now is, what's going to happen to those policy efforts. And so it is important to say that if that support is withdrawn too quickly, some of the very, again, buffering effects and very good effects could be lost and go lost, especially for the most vulnerable households. Next slide, please. So another quite clear fact in our report.
You've got 1 minute as well, I'm afraid.
Sure, I'll go very quickly.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So the pandemic has exacerbated and exposed a long-standing structural weaknesses when it comes to inequalities. But here I just want to focus on one aspect, which is actually the impact on the school systems. And we know that the school systems in many countries, including the OECD, is traditionally and structurally an equalizing factors. It's one of the good thing that countries and governments were putting in place to reduce inequalities. Now, the problem is that all young people, young students, have been particularly affected by the crisis. And so obviously the issue here is that not only the inequalities have increased right now, but the more worrisome effect, in fact, may still have to come and unfold. And so the impacts on social mobility and longer term economic opportunities may also be significant. Next slide, please. And I'll go very, very quickly. This panel is about financing, and obviously in OECD countries, because the response was so large, the pandemic has also put sources of public financing under very strong pressure. The large stimulus packages that have been implemented by OECD countries have been essential, as I mentioned, but they did increase public debt. And so the scissor effect on SDGs financing, so increasing needs at declining resources, in fact, has been magnified by the need to respond to the pandemic. It's not just about the quantity of money that was injected in the economy, but it's also how the money has been spent, because we have seen that in some countries, governments actually have operated with lower standards of consultation, transparency, oversight, or control of the internal processing, of course, because there was a strong urgency and to act immediately, but that came with cost in terms of the quality of the governance of that public spending. Final slide, please. And this is about planet. And here I'm referring to the dark dimensions, the COVID resilience, in the sense that, unfortunately, the temporary improvement of environmental conditions that went together with lockdowns and restrictions in economic activities and leading to a short-term reduction in global emissions of greenhouse gases has already reverted. And in fact, we see that in many, many countries, the recovery is associated with poorer environmental conditions. So in fact, many of the planet targets, even the ones for which countries were supposed to reach good outcomes already by 2020, those have not been met. And in fact, as we know, the long-term scenario are really not looking very good. And so the final word is that, of course, in the recovery packages, there is a lot of emphasis on making sure that the investments are green, the investments are sustainable, but still we see many countries in the OECD that more than half of the investments in infrastructure actually are not as clean and green and sustainable as they should be. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry we had to rush you, but we've got less than 20 minutes now for the rest of our panel. The data you're presenting is incredibly rich. We could spend a whole session just discussing some of the details that you've highlighted, but the three things that I took away from that was obviously how far away we are from addressing some of those critical issues, particularly around climate, but inequalities is also coming out very strongly, that actually we've perpetuated that divide rather than closed it as well. And then you mentioned gender inequality at the beginning too, but we didn't have as much time to go through that today. So I apologize that I feel like I'm rushing you through a very important conversation. I do just want to take 1 minute, if I may, just to come back to our initial three panelists with just a couple of questions. Please could I ask you to be brief, but I want to turn first of all to Mr. Hanif to say, we've got a question here about the role of global governance around closing the gap in financing of the SDGs. And you presented excellent solutions. Which of those solutions could be spearheaded by our global governance systems that can help close this gap?
This question requires an hour of response. So I will be very brief. I want to get into specifics. I will not go into platitudes and general statements. Let me mention two areas. Sovereign debt problems. They come to us after every 10 to 12 years. And we have not found a solution because there is a visible and widely acknowledged gap in global governance on sovereign debt. The UN has made three proposals. First and foremost, please reinforce the responsibilities of lenders and borrowers. Guidelines, principles exist, we don't enforce them. Second, redesign the instruments that you use for lending. You'll be shocked. There are 40-year-old models that we deploy nowadays when the lending has changed dramatically. Third, bring lenders and borrowers on equal footing at one platform. We don't have it. Second area, taxation. Yeah. We do not have a universal platform where all countries can sit on equal footing and talk about taxation globally, and then of course implement nationally. So I just want to flag these two areas, but yes, there are quite a few gaps in the global governance of financial system. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for being so succinct as well. I've got one question and I'd like to turn both to Dr. Sdg first and then Dr. Romina to just give us a different perspective around which, from your perspective, out of the 17 goals are the most important ones from the African perspective, first of all, and then secondly, from the OECD country perspective. So Mr. Sdg, Could you just take us through your perspectives on the African continent, first of all?
So, I mean, during the process of approaching the 17 goals, I think the emphasis is that these 17 goals are indivisible, and the implication is that all of them is important. But however, I think what is important is at country level, and each country actually has to know what is prioritized. The three are important for some countries. For example, in East Africa, climate change issue is so paramount at this moment that it is a kind of priority. And that is linked to social goals and economic goals, because it is having a devastating effect on these other goals. In some other countries, the climate change, it's important, but again, maybe they could structure it around a global kind of, I mean, just to respond to what global efforts could also respond to. They could actually frame it around what globally we could do. But at the local level, social goals actually is like the most important in most of the countries, because like I mentioned, the structural kind of barriers to development is huge, and addressing the social needs actually are the kind of background or framework to actually respond to that.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Romina.
Yeah, I think I would answer to this question at least two ways. I mean, when you talk about importance, I think, you have to appreciate the political dimensions of the SDGs. And we know that countries do have, different priorities national level. So of course, for each of them, they need to make sure that the SDGs sort of fits with what they're trying to do in their own countries. But here, the dimensions needs to be appreciated at global level as well. And so for me, the question is, what would be the areas where, there are the largest opportunities for cooperation? I think, the point of financing and, what that means in terms of relying on common or coordinated taxation systems, financing from the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. These are certainly the areas that I think are more significant. You can also answer to this question just looking at the interactions, because we know that the SDGs, the beauty, but also the complexity is that they are, indivisible. I mean, they're really all kind of intertwined. And so if you do things such as reducing inequalities and promoting health, for instance, you're going to have a number of very important sort of benefits, so cascading down and sort of impacting other goals. So I would certainly say that from this more analytical perspective, if you reduce inequalities and promote health, you probably get most out of it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. I'm going to now move us very quickly to our discussants and hear from them their reflections and thoughts on the three presentations we've just heard. I'm going to turn to our first discussant, His Excellency Walter Alfonso Webson. He's the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN. Your Excellency, over to you to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I trust you can hear me and see me, all right?
You're great. You're absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I know we are short on time, so I will kind of just go through a couple of points listening to the conversation. Countries like Antigua and Barbuda and many of the small island states, we have tremendous uncertainty at this time, and this surrounds the major features of our livelihoods and the global order that has been changed, and how a lot of these things seem to be changed permanently. And the effect on our islands, the financial effects is tremendous. Antigua and Barbuda have always been inherently susceptible to external economic and financial shocks. We are small. We like many small islands, we're remote, so with high cost of transportation. We have a narrow resource base and exhibit high reliance on import, high levels of public debt, and challenging economic growth prospects, all of which was mentioned by the gentleman from the UN. The COVID-19 pandemic poses both an immediate economic, financial challenge for us and is causing social and societal damage. And these challenges will persist well beyond the recovery, especially as we are within the decade of the SDGs. So for us, we're looking at the damage that the COVID-19 pandemic, and not forgetting that despite the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change will always be with these islands. And we're looking at the challenges there, and that these are they're going to be there for us. For especially, we are faced with enormous crisis around debt. It has now become a matter of for us in islands to decide how to realign our finances. Should we pay Peter? Should we pay Paul? How do we do this? Should our finances be put for SDGs, help us to achieve that? Or are we facing really all our finances, putting it into the fight against the pandemic? These are very difficult decisions that many islands are made. Given my country's high debt burden, we are forced to react. We are forced to have loans originally intended for development. We have to turn those into loans that we are fighting the COVID-19. The relief measures and so on. At the same time, we are further forced to acquire new loans to pay off old loans. Urgent and fundamental global measures now are needed to respond to the instability and the uncertainty in the current clouds that hangs over islands. You know, your question, which you pose in your concept, gave me some pause to think, because our overall ambition is to move forward, but SIDS cannot create the necessary fiscal space unless there is a reform or a reshaping of existing international financial frameworks and governance. Why is this? Antigua and Barbuda and the majority of SIDS are classified as either high or middle income countries. And this is an important point before I wrap up. And therefore, support offered by the World Bank and the IMF we can't get that. For example, Antigua and Barbuda cannot access the new DSSI, even when both the World Bank and the IMF concluded that our countries like Antigua and small states are the worst affected by the group of countries, the worst affected by the pandemic amongst all groups of countries. While we lobbied for the extension and expansion of the DSSI, we were told that the rules do not allow for us to join that. So let me just close here then by saying, Madam Chair, Madam Chair, AOSIS, Antigua, and the islands, we are leading AOSIS and the process that I hope will change or address the various gaps in the existing international financial framework is, as we are working with a number of issues such as the multi-vulnerability index. We hope this will allow countries like ours to be able to access their current and future relief. The intergovernmental process of the MVI that is currently on the way at the United Nations is a step in the right direction. We hope others will join and we hope that we would be able to advocate strongly The final thing I want to speak to here is partnerships in shaping the recovery and achieving the SDGs. Partnerships is going to be important. Partnerships is no doubt one of the most important for us. And over the past 2 years, Antigua and Barbuda, working with Malta, chaired the SIDS partnership at the United Nations and began to broaden the partners that both private and public sectors who can join us. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for bringing a focus on the role of partnerships, but also the important point you made around the existing international financing frameworks and governance systems and how they may actually be holding back the appropriate response to the pandemic and its wider impacts. Now I'm going to quickly move to Ambassador Charlotte Schleicher from the Swedish mission to the UN. She is the head of the section for sustainable development, and I'm hoping she'll be able to give us some thoughts and reflections on her perspective on the presentations. But before I hand over to her, I just want to say, I know we've got officially about 5 more minutes of the session, but I've been informed that we can go on beyond the time that we've got by another 5 to 8 minutes. So I'm hoping we can get our last 2 panelists in and then wrap up to close on the hour. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thanks so much. Thank you. It's great to be here. And these have been interesting presentations to listen to. A few things I take away, obviously, is partnerships, institutions need even more than before for stronger institutions, and the role of the UN, and obviously from a donor's perspective, I can't help but starting there a little bit. Now, obviously, we are off track with Agenda 2030, but where would we be without it? It is clearly our blueprint out of this everywhere, and as we've heard, all countries have had setbacks, but it's all relative, I think, if you're an OECD country or elsewhere. So in order to enable the UN to be active as it needs to be, as a donor in this moment in time, we need to stick to the Addis agenda. We need to stick to the funding compact. And that also means sticking to our commitments of 0.7% of ODA. And for Sweden, this has meant in the past few years holding ourselves to 1% of GNI for ODA, and that's where we still are. We continue to provide core funding to the UN and also to partners in civil society, because we believe it's the best way to ensure long-term, stable and flexible funding to be able to, for example, change direction during a pandemic. So I think we've seen even more than before how important that core and flexible funding has been for the UN and other actors to respond more quickly. Obviously, inequality and injustice has been put in the spotlight. Gender equality has been put in the spotlight. I think starting with Agenda 2030, we all know where we need to look. Green recovery measures, obviously, prioritizing the most vulnerable while building resilience and adaptive capacity at the same time. This is a good moment for a deeper reflection on these issues. And I would like to mention that Sweden is organizing a UN high-level meeting in Stockholm called Stockholm +50, which is called A Healthy Planet for the Prosperity of All, Our Responsibility, Our Opportunity. We're organizing this together with Kenya on 2nd to 3rd of June 2022. Partnerships, investors, obviously, institutional investors, private investors. I'd like to mention Global Investors for Sustainable Development, GISD, which is convened by the UN Secretary General, and DESA is leading a project on this. So this is a very important commitment to try and align capital with SDGs and catalyze new investments. I also would like to say a short word about institutions, because it's been mentioned very eloquently, not least by Mr. Hanif, about the need for such institutions for financing to reach to where it needs to be. And in fact, Swedish SIDA has just launched a new effort of financing for development and institution building, which Navid Hanif was there to launch as the main speaker. And I think we can't understate the importance of building institutions. Countries in the north have had more time and resources to build their institutions. Doesn't mean that they're all done and they're work in progress, but I think we do need to continue to share know-how, which could enable financing to reach those in need, especially in least developed countries. And finally, additional partnerships. We do need to work hand in hand with civil society and involve young people in all our efforts if we are to be able to get ourselves out of this. Thank you.
Ambassador, you have very nicely segued into our next panelist, actually. So I'm going to move to introduce her so she can speak to this agenda. And it is the perspective of young people that she'll be bringing in. So I've got the UN Foundation's Next Generation Fellow, Aish Manichi, who led the process of bringing together young people from around the world to contribute to the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report. And she also co-authored our Future Agenda, an accompanying version which provided a vision and a plan for next and future generations. So I'm hoping that Aish will bring much of these ideas together and provide some comments from the next generation of future leaders as well. Aish, over to you.
Thanks very much. First off to say thank you very much, Mr. Hanif, Dr. Romina and Dr. Sdg for the fantastic presentations. I'll try and keep it brief because I know we're technically over time, but I think it's absolutely vital to provide this youth perspective, not just because young people are kind of one of those vulnerable groups that Harpinder mentioned at the beginning, but also because young people do actually add up to about half the world's population. So it's not a group of people that we can underestimate. First, to just say how the pandemic has affected young people, I think it's basically proved that in a crisis, it's actually young people that lose their jobs first. I think 1 in 6 young people were forced to stop working at the onset of the pandemic, and I think efforts to bring them back to work have been slower than amongst other demographics. So this is kind of creating a growing job crisis and economic opportunity crisis for young people, but also has taken us off course towards achieving SDG Goal 8. And the disruption to education is another thing to think about. So this is clearly going to affect young people looking for jobs in the future. One of the first measures in every country was to shut schools. And while some children were able to continue learning, roughly 2/3 of the world's population still don't have access to the internet, which prevented them from learning. I think data is currently suggesting that about $10 trillion could be the result of the lost hours of learning over this kind of generation's incomes in the future. So not only is the pandemic affecting young people in the present, it's also likely to continue doing so in the future, and the effects will likely ricochet in a way that affect progress in all the SDGs. And just to also say that there is obviously quite a global dimension to this. The kind of effects of the pandemic on young people will be most pertinent in those countries with growing numbers of young people, and where the majority of the 10.9 billion people who are likely to be born by the end of this century are going to be born. I think then kind of reflecting on all of this, it feels like the kind of coming out of the pandemic will require there should be two priorities for countries coming out of in recovery. So the first being the creation of jobs for young people, by investing in industries of the future, by putting young people at the heart of net zero initiatives, and also by supporting young entrepreneurs, working with young ministers to develop digital innovation ecosystems, and easing the process for young people to open bank accounts and other essential finance and access to finance. And the second thing is that, you know, actually addressing this digital divide. The internet has to be a kind of global public good, and it's completely essential to invest in infrastructure to improve access to the internet in remote areas, and also work with technology companies to invest in training a new generation of young workers. So I think obviously the question is now how. You know, this is obviously asking for a lot more investment, but I think, you know, there's two kind of things to keep in mind. So the first is that actually both of the points and priorities that I've suggested above will actually generate more jobs and economic opportunities in the future. As Dr. Romina kind of signaled, it's the idea of kind of cascading effects. So greener economy, for example, could create 24 million jobs by 2030, of which many could go to young workers. And the second thing I think to keep in mind is actually it feels like a matter of choice whether or not we prioritize young people in future generations. As you kind of mentioned, Dr. Romina, green spending is actually making up a very little amount of COVID-19 recovery money. I think G20 countries have now spent $250 billion on new support for fossil fuels in a time when they actually should be directing this towards kind of greener investments. And I mean, imagine if this was funneled into new and innovative ways of funding youth action and harnessing the potential of young people rather than stifling their development and economic opportunities. So I think just my final point is to say that I think the creation of new jobs for young people and youth and supporting youth entrepreneurship should be a priority at the upcoming G20 in Indonesia. And basically the international community start seeing the priorities of young people as actually the interests and priorities of the international community as a whole.
Aish, thank you so much for your final comments, which have helped bring our discussion together and making it very focused also on what does it mean for half of the world's population, the younger part of the world that has been, as we know, hugely affected, hugely impacted by a lot of the measures that were put in place to manage the pandemic, the impacts, the effects of the health effects, should I say, of the pandemic. Now, a very quick synopsis before I thank everybody who has been involved in putting this incredible discussion together. Firstly, our speakers have highlighted the financing challenges we face from the global, regional, down to the national levels, including the challenges of an uneven recovery, the unequitable access to vaccines that we're seeing, rising debt burdens, constraints on DRM, all of which are contributing to a growing financing gap on the SDGs. But I really also liked the way that one of our speakers described the growing financing gap as a financing opportunity as well. And that's where we saw some of our speakers highlight the importance of partnerships between different kinds of actors, public, private CSOs, to help those most in need, as well as improving targeting, but also leveraging new financing, while also looking at some of the structural and institutional reforms that we need to bring in to actually address some of the limitations of our existing global financial architecture as well. And throughout the conversation, we've had a focus very much on the importance of making sure that our recovery is sustainable. And it's very much in line with ensuring that climate and environmental factors are taken into consideration. So it doesn't hurt the planet, but helps us think about how we sustainably thrive into the future as people alongside the planet on which we inhabit as well. Just want to say a huge thank you for an incredibly rich discussion for all of our panelists and the presentations you have provided. I apologize the time was so limited and we haven't had time to explore some of the rich comments you've brought in today. But I would also want to thank our hosts, in particular the UN Foundation and Southern Voice, who have played a central role in enabling this conversation to happen today. Thank you very much for every single one of you for participating and helping this discussion be so important. I wish you the best for the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.